Pick up a mascara tube, turn it over, read the ingredients list on the back. You will find, typically in this order, water, beeswax or carnauba wax, iron oxides for pigment, a polymer film former like polyvinyl alcohol or acrylates copolymer, preservatives, usually phenoxyethanol, parabens or DMDM hydantoin, and a series of conditioning, thickening, and stabilizing agents that make the formula adhere to lashes, stay wet in the tube, and survive the 4 to 8 hours between morning application and evening removal. This is the ingredient architecture of one of the most purchased cosmetic products on Earth. Mascara is used daily by an estimated 50% of women in developed economies. The majority begin using it in their teens and continue for decades. And the ingredient architecture you just read is being applied daily to the thinnest, most permeable, most anatomically unprotected skin on the human body. Not to facial skin at 2 millimeters, not to neck skin at 1 millimeter, to eyelid skin at 0.3 millimeters, thinner than cling film, containing almost no subcutaneous fat, almost no sebaceous gland output, and a barrier layer so thin that compounds which would sit safely on the surface of normal facial skin penetrate to the living dermis in minutes. The reason your eyelids age faster if you wear eye makeup daily is not a single mechanism. It is 4 simultaneous mechanisms operating in the same microscopic tissue zone, day after day, for decades. And the cosmetics industry that sells you the mascara has never printed a word about any of them on the back of the tube. Welcome to Maylin. Subscribe and hit the bell. Our complete anti-aging book covers every mechanism, environmental, dietary, mechanical, and chemical, that drives accelerated aging of the face and eyelid, organized in one resource. Link in the description and in the comments. Now let me decode the back of that tube. The first mechanism begins the moment the mascara contacts the eyelid margin. Every mascara formula, without exception, contains preservatives. They are a pharmaceutical and cosmetic necessity. Without them, a water-containing product would culture bacteria within days and present a serious infection risk to the eye. The preservatives used in mascara are functional. They are also small molecules. Phenoxyethanol has a molecular weight of 138 Daltons. Parabens range from 152 to 285 Daltons. The threshold for passive transdermal penetration through the stratum corneum, the weight below which molecules can pass through the intercellular lipid channels of the skin barrier, is approximately 500 Daltons. On normal facial skin at 2 millimeters, these preservatives encounter a stratum corneum of meaningful thickness and a viable epidermis separated from the surface by sufficient layers of protective tissue that the concentrations reaching the living cells are below the threshold for significant inflammatory activation. On eyelid skin at 0.3 millimeters, they penetrate to the viable epidermis and the upper dermis rapidly and at concentrations that are not trivially small. Research published in Contact Dermatitis has consistently documented that the eyelid is the most common anatomical site of cosmetic contact sensitization, not because people apply more products there than elsewhere, but because the eyelid's extreme permeability means that concentrations of preservative and fragrance compounds reaching the living tissue are proportionally higher for the same surface application dose. Repeated daily exposure of the thin eyelid dermis to preservative compounds at these penetration concentrations produces a chronic subclinical inflammatory state. Not the dramatic redness of acute contact dermatitis, but the persistent low-grade cytokine environment that activates MMP collagen severing enzymes in the periorbital dermis at concentrations insufficient to cause visible irritation, but entirely sufficient to drive progressive structural collagen loss over years. You are not allergic to your mascara. Your eyelid skin is simply too thin to receive its preservative load without a chronic inflammatory consequence that your dermis is recording, while your mirror shows you nothing unusual. The second mechanism is in the formula's emulsifier and wax system. Most mascaras contain emulsifying waxes, cetyl alcohol, stearic acid, polysorbate compounds that stabilize the oil-water emulsion of the formula and allow it to adhere to lashes consistently. These are functionally identical in their surface chemistry to the emulsifier compounds I discussed previously in the context of facial moisturizers, compounds confirmed by researchers at the University of Copenhagen to bind to the intercellular ceramides of the skin barrier and wash them away through normal moisture contact and daily removal. On facial skin, this emulsifier-ceramide interaction produces barrier disruption that requires weeks of daily moisturizer use to become clinically significant. On eyelid skin, the dynamics are compressed by the anatomical reality of the tissue. The eyelid stratum corneum is thin. The ceramide content of the intercellular lipid matrix is correspondingly smaller in total volume. A single day's mascara application and removal depletes a proportionally greater fraction of the eyelid's total barrier ceramide content than a day of facial moisturizer use depletes of the facial barrier ceramide content. Repeat this depletion every day for years. The eyelid barrier becomes chronically compromised. Transepidermal water loss in the periorbital zone increases progressively. The dermis beneath the eyelid skin, already the thinnest dermis on the face, begins operating in a chronic dehydration state that reduces its structural volume, deepens the apparent shadow of the orbital socket, and amplifies the visual prominence of the orbital fat pad that produces both eyelid puffiness and the hollow, sunken appearance of advanced periorbital aging. The fine lines around the eyes that deepen with every decade of daily mascara wear are not solely the product of years of squinting and expression. They are partly the product of a compromised eyelid barrier that has been losing water at above normal rates because the emulsifier system in the formula applied daily has been progressively depleting the ceramide content that should have prevented that loss. The third mechanism is the waterproofing. Waterproof mascara and long-wear eyeliner formulas contain film-forming polymers. Polyvinyl alcohol, acrylates/octyl-acrylamide copolymer, dimethicone, that form an occlusive film over the lash and the eyelid skin during wear. This occlusion prevents normal transepidermal water loss through the eyelid during the hours of application. The skin beneath the film is sealed. Moisture accumulates between the film and the skin surface. When the formula is applied in the morning, the eyelid skin enters an atypically high humidity microenvironment that alters the hydration gradient of the stratum corneum. When the formula is removed at night, that high humidity environment abruptly terminates. The stratum corneum, which had been maintaining itself in the abnormal occlusion environment, now reequilibrates to ambient conditions. This reequilibration involves a rapid transient increase in tool. The skin loses water quickly as the concentration gradient between the previously occluded surface and the dry ambient air establishes. This occlusion, then rapid dehydration cycle, performed daily over years, stresses the eyelid barrier in a pattern that no other common cosmetic use replicates. The barrier adapted to occlusion during the day has different lipid organization than a barrier adapted to normal ambient conditions. The daily cycling between these two states prevents the barrier from fully stabilizing in either. Cumulative barrier instability means cumulative inflammatory activation means cumulative MMP-driven collagen degradation, the same endpoint as mechanisms 1 and 2, reached through a completely different pathway. 3 separate routes to the same structural damage, all operating in the same 0.3 millimeter tissue. The fourth mechanism is the one that produces the most immediately visible damage, and the one that the industry has responded to with the most product innovation, while addressing none of the structural consequence. The physical removal of mascara and eyeliner, particularly waterproof formulas. The film-forming polymers that make waterproof mascara resistant to water and sweat are not removed by water. They require either an oil-based solvent to dissolve the polymer film or friction to physically break and lift it from the lash and eyelid surface. Most women who remove waterproof mascara use both, an eye makeup remover applied on a cotton pad, pressed to the eye, and then swept across the eyelid surface in repeated strokes that combine chemical action with physical friction. The physical friction component applies tangential mechanical stress to eyelid skin that is already barrier compromised from the day of wear. Research on mechanical friction and dermal collagen architecture, including the research on skin surface friction and EMP activation that has been documented across multiple dermatology publications, confirms that repeated tangential mechanical stress applied to thin, barrier-compromised skin produces measurably greater collagen disorganization than the same friction applied to intact skin. The eyelid at night, after 8 hours of mascara wear, is not intact skin. It is barrier-compromised, preservative-exposed, ceramide-depleted skin. And across that skin, the removal friction is being applied. Every night. The cumulative consequence of this daily mechanical stress on the eyelid collagen architecture is most visible in two specific presentations. The first is the progressive deepening of periorbital lines, the compression wrinkles that form perpendicular to the direction of the removal stroke, most commonly in the lateral orbital zone where the cotton pad exerts the most pressure. The second is the progressive thinning of the upper eyelid skin, the tissue that is directly beneath the mascara application zone and that experiences the combination of all four mechanisms simultaneously: preservative penetration, emulsifier, ceramide depletion, waterproofing occlusion-rebound, and removal friction every single day. The orbital fat pad consequence is worth addressing specifically because it is the structural change that produces the most profound long-term visual difference between eyes that have been protected and eyes that have experienced daily makeup wear and removal across decades. The orbital fat pad, the adipose tissue that sits behind the orbital septum and contributes to the youthful fullness of the upper and lower eyelid, is maintained in its correct anatomical position by the orbital septum, a thin fascial membrane. The orbital septum is a collagen-rich structure. Repeated daily mechanical traction on the eyelid skin during makeup removal applies stress to the orbital septum through the skin to septum connective tissue attachments. Across years of daily removal, this repeated traction stress contributes to orbital septum collagen depletion and laxity. A lax orbital septum allows the orbital fat pad to migrate forward, producing the herniated fat appearance of lower eyelid puffiness and upper eyelid heaviness that oculoplastic surgeons address with blepharoplasty. The blepharoplasty removes the herniated fat and tightens the septum surgically. The daily makeup removal that contributed to the septal laxity is not mentioned in the pre-operative consultation. What reduces the cumulative damage is not a different mascara. It is a different application and removal ritual that addresses the specific mechanisms rather than their cosmetic appearance. For removal, the critical change is the elimination of friction. Oil-based removers, specifically micellar oils rather than micellar waters, which still require friction to function on waterproof formulas, are pressed against the closed eye and held for 30 to 45 seconds without movement. During that hold, the oil solvent dissolves the polymer film of the mascara and the wax system of the eyeliner without any mechanical stress being applied to the eyelid skin. After the hold, the dissolved formula is gently pressed off with the pad in a single downward motion, one stroke, no rubbing. The friction component of removal is eliminated. The orbital septum traction that rubbing produces does not occur. For application, a thin coating of pure jojoba oil applied to the lashes before mascara creates a buffer layer between the mascara formula and the lash follicle, reducing direct contact between the formula's preservatives and the follicular skin. For frequency, 2 days per week of complete eye makeup abstinence provides the periorbital barrier with time for ceramide resynthesis and structural recovery that cannot occur during continuous daily application. On these rest days, a ceramide-containing eye area product applied before sleep directly addresses the barrier depletion that the preceding application days produced, not to treat the aging. To restore the barrier that the weekly application cycle has progressively depleted. The cosmetics industry's response to the documentation of these mechanisms has been the development of what it markets as nourishing or conditioning mascaras, formulas that include panthenol, peptides, vitamin E, or biotin alongside the standard mascara architecture. These additions address the surface presentation of eyelash health. They do not alter the preservative penetration depth determined by the eyelid's anatomical thinness. They do not change the emulsifier-ceramide interaction that depletes the barrier with each application. They do not eliminate the occlusion-rebound cycle of waterproof polymer films, and they do not remove the friction component of the removal ritual. The conditioning agents are cosmetically meaningful. Lashes that receive panthenol daily are softer and less brittle than lashes that do not. The structural damage to the eyelid skin from which those lashes grow is not meaningfully affected. The industry knows the difference between lash conditioning and eyelid skin structural protection. The marketing does not make that distinction because the marketing sells mascara, and a structural protection claim requires an honest description of what the product is doing to the tissue it is applied to. No mascara packaging in the history of the cosmetics industry has carried that description. Our complete anti-aging book covers every topical, mechanical, and chemical mechanism that drives accelerated aging of the face, eyelid, neck, and body, organized by cause and by what the peer-reviewed research actually documents. Link in the description and in the comments. If this opened something for you, subscribe and share it with everyone you know who wears mascara daily and has never once been told what the back of that tube means for the skin it contacts. Every share gets that information to someone who deserved it the first time they picked up a mascara wand. The next vault opens soon. I'm Dr. Mei Lin. Thank you for listening to Mei Lin Health. There is a fifth dimension to this story that connects all four mechanisms to a consequence that most people notice, but attribute entirely to genetics or age: lash thinning and loss. The eyelash follicles sit at the eyelid margin, the precise anatomical boundary between the conjunctival tissue and the eyelid skin. They are embedded in the same tissue that is simultaneously receiving the four mechanisms described above. Preservative penetration at the follicular opening. Emulsifier-driven ceramide depletion in the follicular lipid environment. Waterproofing polymer occlusion of the follicular opening and the associated rebound after removal. And the mechanical traction of daily mascara removal applied directly across the follicular shaft. Each individual lash follicle is a miniaturized version of a scalp hair follicle. It has a dermal papilla at its base that produces the lash fiber, a surrounding sebaceous gland that lubricates the follicular canal, and a perifollicular vascular network that supplies nutrients and oxygen to the papilla. The perifollicular vasculature of the eyelash follicle is exquisitely sensitive to the chronic inflammatory cytokine environment produced by preservative penetration and barrier disruption. Research on alopecia, hair loss driven by perifollicular inflammation, confirms that chronic inflammatory infiltration of the perifollicular tissue is one of the primary mechanisms of follicular miniaturization and eventual dormancy. The same inflammatory cascade that produces periorbital collagen loss through EMP activation also reaches the perifollicular tissue of the lash follicles. The progressive lash thinning that most women experience across decades of daily mascara wear. The lashes that are thinner at 50 than they were at 25. The gaps in the lash line that were not there a decade ago is not entirely genetic or hormonal. It is partly the consequence of a chronic perifollicular inflammatory environment that daily mascara application and removal has been maintaining. The eyelash serum category, a $1.4 billion annual market selling bimatoprost analogs and peptide formulations to stimulate lash growth, exists in part because the mascara category has created the deficit that the serum category sells the correction for. The same industry segment, the same eyelid, one product creating the problem, another product profiting from the solution. Neither one explaining what is connecting them. Understanding this connection changes the calculation around daily mascara use in a way that no beauty brand has any interest in facilitating. The question is not whether mascara is cosmetically valuable. It is. The question is whether the daily compounding of 4 damage mechanisms across the thinnest skin on the face, continued without any structural countermeasures, represents a reasonable trade for the cosmetic benefit. For most people who have thought about it in terms of how mascara looks, the answer has always been yes. For most people who have not thought about it in terms of what 4 simultaneous mechanisms operating in 0.3 millimeter skin accumulate to across 20 years of daily wear, the question has never been framed in terms they could answer. The information to answer it has been in the research literature for decades. It has been in contact dermatitis studies, in barrier function research, in perifollicular inflammation studies, and in mechanical stress and collagen architecture papers. It has simply never been on the back of a mascara tube. Not because the research is obscure. Because the mascara market generates $12 billion annually, and the information that belongs on that tube would require an honest conversation about what that tube costs the tissue it touches. A conversation that the industry has decided, year after year, product launch after product launch, is one it would rather not have. The eyelid is the earliest facial zone to show visible aging in most people. The first fine lines appear there. The first hollowing. The first heaviness. The first loss of lash density. Aesthetic medicine attributes this to its thin anatomy, which is correct, and frames that thin anatomy as an inevitable vulnerability that only products and procedures can manage. What is not framed, because it does not generate product revenue, is that the thin anatomy of the eyelid is also what makes it the most sensitive indicator of whether what is being applied to it daily is supporting or damaging the tissue underneath. The eyelid does not lie. It records every daily application and removal event in its collagen architecture, its barrier ceramide content, its perifollicular inflammatory load, and its orbital septum integrity. It began recording the day the first mascara wand was applied. The record continues every morning until the last time the tube is picked up. What the record shows is available in the research. What it shows is not on the back of the tube. Now it is somewhere that it can be found.